Welcome to After the Hack. I'm your host, Francesca, and I'm joined by Peter, Tom, and Femi. After the Hack is a limited podcast series where we'll be breaking down the new ITV drama, a 7-part ITV Studios drama about the phone hacking scandal. We're going to be doing a deep dive into the hack and what came after. So we are starting with episode 1, which picks up pretty much where the scandal all began with journalist Nick Davies, how he learns about the scandal, how it's much bigger than he thought it was, and how he chooses to start to uncover it. Let's start, I think, with the big picture stuff, instant gut reactions. This was our first taste of this new drama. What do we think? What are the initial vibes?
Well, I mean, I'd want to hear what people who don't know the story, really, or Nick Davis, or Alan Rusbridger, or Rebecca Brooks, or make of it. I mean, I found it quite entertaining in some ways. The bit I most liked, actually, to be honest, is not be able to start writing it. How do you write the story? Because that's very journalistic. You tried 20 openings, and I think
gave me PTSD. That
exactly, the blank page. And I think that is a issue with the series. Obviously, where do you start the drama? I mean, they start it with Nick Davis. He wrote a book called Flat Earth News 2007-8, which is about decline of the news industry, journalism. And there's a chapter in there about the dark arts. And and there you see him on radio arguing with this guy, Stuart Kuttner, who's the managing editor of News of the World. And I think that is an interesting place to start. Okay, could you have started somewhere else? Rebecca Brooks, the head of CEO of News International at that time, playing cops in front of MPs. So I'm going through it going, interesting they started there. Interesting that's what they emphasize. And whether it works or not, because I know this so well, I really defer to you guys.
I think that's a really good point. The fact that the way he starts it by saying, I don't know how to start this. And he starts it in very different ways. First, he starts with this talk of how the public doesn't understand that they're being abused by a system, a cabal of journalists, of politicians, of the police that all conspire against them. And then he switches to, let's go with a more narrative style of, it started with this guy. And then it goes to, it became like this thing that took down all the most powerful people in the country. So he tried the sensational route, the ideological route, the narrative route. Which way do you start with? And those will hook different types of people. And if you are a newspaper editor and you're trying and hook as many people, you might want to go with the sensationalist bit, but that might turn some people off. Whereas actually for me, I think the best start was the one he started with of this is about the power that these people have and the abuse that they perpetrate against the people of the UK.
Yeah, I found it quite intriguing. I think there are bits of the style, the way they've chosen to present the story, which work really well. I think others maybe don't work so well, and we can talk about the specific presentation of bits of the story or the way the characters interact. I think what stood out for me, coming away at the end of the first episode and as the drama unfolds and they go through the different moments, I came away realizing that there's a huge kind of open... There's a gap, a big piece of the puzzle missing in what they present in this first episode, which is they don't really at any point address the Murdochs and the Murdoch media empire and the real power, the kind of pervasive power that the Murdoch media empire had at this time, and therefore how significant it was that Nick Davies and Alan Rusbridger decided at this moment, on the basis of the strength of the evidence they had, we're going to take them on. You have to think that back in 2008, 2009, all of British politics, culture, popular entertainment had really been reshaped by the Murdoch empire through Sky News, through the tabloids, through the way they reported on celebrities or TV or reality and music and all these things. So it was a huge, literally the most powerful private organization in the country to decide to go up against. And I found it strange that really throughout this first episode, the actual references to Rupert Murdoch or even Rebecca Brooks were very sort of glancing blows. There wasn't that moment where either of the sort of main two characters, Davies or Rusbridger, sat back and said, this is who we're up against. This is the real big beast. It sort of implied that, the press are, powerful and it's with newspapers going against newspapers, does it really end well? But yeah, that thing that's missing so far for me is that moment to stand back and go, this is how big it was at this time to do this. This is who they were taking on. Maybe that'll unfold in other episodes, but at the moment it feels to me like alongside the detail of this is what we investigated, this is who we spoke to, that overarching, the huge shadow that looms over everything they're doing, which is they were taking on the Murdochs at the peak of their power.
Yes, can I just add the detail to that in that that era, it's before they do mention Andy Coulson, who goes on for Medicine News the World, goes on to become Cameron's press communications head. But at this time, Tony Blair had been godson to Rupert Murdoch's two children, with Wendy Deng. At this time, the News International Party, the summer party, you had to go and pay court to Rebecca and kiss the ring of Murdoch. And I think under New Labour, it's probably as bad as had been. John Major,
absolutely.
As bad as Thatcher. And you're right, and that's what supporting Femi's point. That line. There is this secret force in the world which kind of distorts our field of vision. We can't even see it. It's distorting our field of vision. That could have been demonstrated with so many clips, so much sense of Murdoch. And I don't know if that was legal fear or just, but I think of those three narratives you chose, Femi, the personal, the sensation, the kind of social, cultural, that would have helped a lot to understand the stakes.
I was just going to say, and that's the missing piece from the audience, is I don't know what the stakes are at the end of this. I don't know what it means for Nick Davies at the end to appear at that select committee. What is at stake? What could happen to Nick Davies personally if these people come after him? What does that mean? And I understand there's a tendency sometimes to over-explain or over-exposition things, which can also be hammy and annoying. But also, we can't treat the audience like they definitely know all of this either. So there was a kind of balance, I think, at times that was kind of missing. I don't know if the rewriting always worked, because again, it's kind of more telling people rather than showing. Again, you mentioned using clips and things like that instead of, you're actually just reading someone writing, which is actually quite boring. I don't want to do that with my own work as a journalist. I don't want to watch. I don't want to David Tennant do it either.
Look, just the story, they could have started a bit later, and it does get very scary, Philip. I know him, and Alan Rusbridge's house is broken into. They're threatened. They're followed. And because we end on him just going to Parliament, that seemed quite a low stakes kind of cliffhanger.
So regarding the not mentioning Murdoch by name, I do take your point. I think if you'd had more explicit reference to him, that would have really nailed down, right, this is what we're up against. But I also think that maybe it does work quite well in a sense of you see the influence that he's having, that media empire, that shadowy force is having on everything that happens to people, and he's more of a sort of he who must not be named. But you don't know who he is, but you can see the effect. Like in that first Today program interview, you can see that how difficult it is for him to even get his words out because the press is essentially conspiring against him. He goes in there with a story to tell about the malfeasance, the misconduct of people in the press, and he's basically crowded out by the people trying to defend the press.
Yeah, the press having to tell on themselves. Maybe they won't do that. They might struggle.
Yeah, and I think, it may not even necessarily be about mentioning Murdoch specifically as the head of the empire, but there's that moment where David Tennant kind of turns to the audience and says, look, we've got the mastheads here of the screws of the world and the super away current bun, and we couldn't use the real mastheads because, unsurprisingly, the publishers wouldn't let us use it. But then what is missing from there on is like examples of what those headlines were. We know what the mast of the Sun looks like. We know what the masthead of the News of the World looked like back in the day. These were, defining icons of British popular culture at that time. What we don't see is what they were writing about and how they wrote about it. The scale of the coverage of different political issues, different cultural issues, the scale of the celebrity obsession of the tabloid press at that time, and the fact that some of those headlines were very abusive and harmful towards the victims who we eventually discover were at the core of the hacking scandal. So there's definitely that element of it's the shadow, it's the person that can't be named, it's the force that we can't challenge, so we just avoid talking about it. And certainly there's moments where I think Alan Rusbridger, the character, Toby Jones sort of says, we're really going up against this. This guy's very powerful. Is it going to be worth it? But what felt missing for me was that kind of background hum of this isn't just an organization. This is a media organization. It's something that is always pumping out its power and its influence in the public consciousness.
I think that's for me I was a crime writer, TV dramatist for many years. Who's the victim, right? I think they did quite, and I know Nick, and I remember the moment he told me that his mother was deeply involved in criminal justice. I thought, I was giving a talk with him, 2016, and she used to beat me up. I'd say, you do have this amazing story of sort of bullying and from unexpected quarters. But so I remember 2008, 2009 when the stories came out, and a bit of me was going, people listen to voicemails. Yeah, well, so what? A few celebrities what's the big story? Only when you talk to the victims and how those were deployed. So, people thought their deepest, darkest secrets, pregnancies, affairs, where they're going, who they're meeting. Suddenly, the press know about it. And of course, their assumption is their closest friends, their mother, their brother, their lover has betrayed them. Gascoigne, Gaza talks quite wonderfully. He's really traumatized by this. And I think, and the second episode is slightly different. We won't get to that. But who is the victim here? What are we know the stakes for but it's not quite the same as Mr. Bates, is it? I might get abused for a story in the Guardian. Some other press might take the mickey out of me, or it's not really up there. It's like a dentist, missing a filling. It's not up there with Mr. Bates. And my life is ruined. My partner's left me. I've been exposed having an affair, or somebody's leaked the fact that I'm pregnant, and my best friend. It's difficult. It's always difficult telling these stories, but I would say they're trying to make kind of Nick Davis both victim and hero. Here, it's obviously the hero, journalist as hero, all the president's men. He fits well in that mode. Just so you know, I think David Tennant does channel him quite well. I know Nick. I mean, they look very different, but Nick has this wiry, funny energy and is very dedicated and, really, feels he's in a battle. But, that person isn't necessarily a victim, and the stakes are really told by the victim.
Yeah, because I think by the end of this first episode, the only victim is, in a way, the truth about the Gordon Taylor settlement, which is, of course, the core of that first Guardian article they published in July 2009, saying that News of the World had paid over £1 million in settlement to Gordon Taylor to effectively cover up the truth of the extent of their phone hacking, to not admit that it wasn't just one rogue reporter at the News of the World, but actually there were multiple reporters at News of the World who were aware of and commissioning hacking. But as you say, Peter, Gordon Taylor and his two assistants who were part of that settlement are sort of presented as just sort of slightly aggrieved individuals. They're a bit pissed off and they want this resolved, when really their lives were hacked into and their privacy was abused. And yes, of course, Gordon Taylor was a major public figure, but even that's setting the scene for, they went for the very powerful and public people. We don't yet know in the show that they also went for very ordinary people in very tragic circumstances. But yeah, as you say, these crime dramas need a clear victim. And at the moment, the victim is, did we know about a settlement or not?
Where they got £1 million. The other thing is that, having been a journalist on these sort of stories, one is, it's difficult to tell, and maybe you need to fictionalize why they hack and how they deploy that. It's always business. It's always compromise. There's some political aim. They target somebody for some reason at a certain time. The whole Max Clifford stuff is, we've got this story in the drawer when we deploy it. And then I'm sure it would have been this way. I worked with Carol Cadwallader at the Observer when she did the Cambridge Analytica. You go to comment, right? You get the lawyers' letters. They appear on TV ahead of you. They disgrace, they try to discredit you publish. So that moment of publication, the hoops you have to get through to actually publish something like that, I kind of miss that drama, that press public.
Yeah. So on the issue of having an identifiable victim to really frame the story around, I think that's why it opens by saying the public is the victim, by saying the public is being abused by this conspiracy of politicians, police, and journalists. And I think that's the point. I think that's why there's this analogy that you can see throughout that entire first episode of abuse. You can see it with the fact that he, as Nick Davies, as a child, was abused by his mother. Nick Davies' son was abused by the bully. Even the dung beetle having to eat crap. Abuse is the metaphor that runs throughout, and that notion of, once you do have something, a vulnerability in the abuser, you have to clamp onto it. That's the advice he gives his son, that once you can see that the bully has a weakness, grab onto that with all the might you've got. And I think with this, we're talking about the one time we've actually been able to seriously take down some people in the press is the phone hacking scandal. And so that's the one time you've got to tackle this Murdoch empire, you have to grab onto it with both hands and do everything you can to take them down. Otherwise, the abuse will continue.
Yeah, and I think actually, that's really interesting, because there's, of course, that moment in the show when his son comes home from school after taking Nick Davies' advice, and he's been punched. He tried to challenge the bully, and he's been hit. So there is a bit of a metaphor there before, the actual hacking drama doesn't get into that bit yet. But the concern that if you do find that moment of vulnerability and you do decide to challenge those who have the power, are you going to get hit back really badly? And there are multiple moments over the course of the hacking scandal where the Guardian does get hit very badly. Either they manage to recover from it, or they have to sort of change their account. But that was their big concern ahead of publishing this first story was,
Mm.
are we going to be punched so heavily that we won't get back up?
And because we're being told this through the story of Nick Davies, who himself, you see the flashback to when he was with his mother, and his mother is like, "Are you going to apologize?" And he looks up, knowing he's going to get some consequences for this, says, "No, I'm not going to apologize." So that, and he obviously would have been hit further after that. And I think he was making the point that even if you do get hit, it is so important to tackle the people who do abuse their power, because otherwise the abuse will continue and there will never be any justice.
Yeah, and there were moments after they published this very first story about the Gordon Taylor settlement. There were moments where effectively News International did come out and say, "You're wrong. You must apologize to us." Peter, you spoke about in the preview about, Rebecca Brooks saying, "I want Alan Rusbridger's head on a platter for this story." That was when they thought they had all the strength, when they didn't know the evidence that the Guardian had, and they thought it was just, they're firing their shot, they're seeing what sticks. It's not going to work. We're going to fire all our power back at them and get Alan Rusbridger's head on a spike. So,
and the rest of the media colluded. The classic omerta, mafiosi silence. So I remember Stephen Glover, independent founder of the Independent, saying, I think it's in the Independent, Nick Davis would find a conspiracy in a jar of tadpoles.
Yeah,
and though they came on board later, the Times, Telegraph were quite good at when it broke.
Yeah.
That omerta. I remember Alan Rusbridger telling me a story. I better not name names, but when they used to have a media section of the Guardian, and they used to cover a certain newspaper, a News International paper, managing editor came to him and said, "This must stop." And it had a big brown envelope. He thought it had money in it. It was all the articles they'd written about this newspaper. So they, this sense, this code of silence, because, and I don't know how you explain this, maybe it'll come out. I think everything you say, Femi, is very important, that you hooked onto this personal story. Me and Tom are these experts. I love to think Banseca said, but how do you get into this vast structural story? But in the 90s, worked for Murdoch remotely through a digital arm working on a computer game, right? Your chance, if you spoke up against Murdoch, you had 50% of the circulation of Fleet Street, 50% of the revenues, 40% of the circulation with all those newspapers, the Times, the News of the World, the Sun, let alone, I think by that point, the TLS. Your career is lost. Because 50% of your employment chances are with this one guy. And even if he doesn't personally remember, his lieutenants will remember and they'll patrol it. That monopoly power.
And I think, if you think about shows like Succession, I think I mentioned that in the preview before, that's a very deft way of demonstrating at that level, literally in those boardrooms and with those subordinates of, the kind of head honcho, like how that all works and how people fall out of favor with this incredibly powerful sort of multimedia baron. And I think it is definitely possible to portray that and show that, but we've simply not quite seen it in the show as of yet. I want to steer us quickly as well there were lots of different faces and people in this show, including people I was not expecting to see, like Connie Huck. Haven't seen her in about 10 years. She's looking great. But we do also get a mention of a Sir Keir Starmer in the first episode already. And I'd be very curious because I was kind of surprised. Oh, Keir Starmer. I'd be very interested to hear what people thought about that mention and the ways in which he might kind of be part of a developing story that seems to involve basically bloody everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliffhanger in the middle of the program, right? It's a mention of the current Prime Minister in his then role as the Director of Public Prosecutions. Of course, when The Guardian had published this story and they'd sort of shamed the Met into showing that they hadn't investigated the documents they had from these private investigators as thoroughly as they should have, Keir Starmer, as the Director of Public Prosecutions, then made a statement saying, well, we're not sure either that there's anything more to investigate here. We've had a look, they do their own miniature investigation and decide. We don't think there's anything more to investigate. We don't think the Guardian has revealed anything. So that becomes there's 2 or 3 moments, and this is the first mention of the direct role of Keir Starmer then as DPP, of another element of the kind of establishment cover-up, or the establishment, deference to the industry position, which is that, well, we've not really learned anything new here, so we shan't investigate anymore. And that will keep coming up time and time again until eventually it becomes unsustainable.
It's very specific here. I mean, for background, he's the Director of Public Prosecutions there, right? So he's interpreting the law. And you've got to understand, with the phalanx of lawyers that News International have, very senior former Labour members, a previous DPP was advising them, right? And Murdoch did the same in America. They had attorney generals advising him, who's been under governments, is the law over, and maybe that'll come out later, is listening to a voicemail the same as interception unlawful, basically. And so it wasn't just the police didn't look at these sacks of evidence which have come out later, which they had from the private investigator who had been arrested the first time around, in 2006. But what was the crime?
Yeah. Nobody
quite had pinned down the crime. So, and then I think, well, I don't want to give anything away, but Starmer does play a key role. And I can say it's rather surprising that he now writes in The Sun, because I remember, particularly after the phone, he was a big target of, before he became leader of the Labour Party, a big target of News International, because, well, let's not give anything away, but he didn't, it doesn't quite end up the way they wanted.
No. But it's interesting that at this moment in the story, in the result of the very first Guardian reporting, as you say, they were looking for more evidence of where the CPS may feel they are required to prosecute people again or to arrest people again. And, it's, again, that story of the weight of the challenge the Guardian had, who they were up against. It wasn't just being up against News International and the Metropolitan Police. It was very many politicians who did not see this as a story worth investigating. It was the Director of Public Prosecutions who, as you say, by following the law and the interpretation of the law that was available to him, did not see anything to pursue. So really many elements of the state and the media and politics were in this very brief window between the Guardian story coming out and the evidence they presented the Select Committee in those, I think, only 3 or 4 days. When this explosive story came out, everybody was against them and everybody was convinced there's nothing here. This is just the Guardian, throwing shit at a wall and seeing what sticks.
And I have to say as well, I mean, this kind of theme around, well, it wasn't against the rules in the kind of black and white of it, so it's fine. That's a theme that I think has continued to haunt Keir Starmer right from the beginning of his time in government, when we had, the beginning of his time in government was marked with scandals of, his wife having all her clothes bought for her and, cabinet ministers, getting free gifts here and free gifts there. And the line that was trotted out was, well, it wasn't against the rules. It's all been written down. And so that's something that, may be, continuing to kind of haunt him and maybe part of his undoing long term as well. So I think that was super interesting, the way he got inserted.
Yeah, I hope there's more to come. As Peter said, Keir Starmer does play a role as this goes on. So I hope that's not the last time we hear about it.
And I think that given that in the last month or so, Keir Starmer has managed to find himself somehow implicated in both the Epstein and phone hacking scandal, he's having a great month.
We'll see how long he lasts. Okay, I want to pick up on this thing as well. We talked a little bit about Nick Davies, and obviously you, Peter, you know him personally as well. I was quite interested in this idea as well of, to me, in many ways, Nick is portrayed as a kind of archetypal journalist in this type of scandal story. He's maybe a bit jaded, a little bit cynical. He's got his battered leather jacket on, he's got his glasses halfway down his face half the time. He's a freelancer as well, which I thought was interesting that they mentioned that. So he's somewhat on the outskirts. I'll say that as a freelancer, so I can sound like I'm more subversive than I am. But on the other hand, he does still, in the episodes, still seem to have some kind of a faith in these institutions. And this idea that if we break this story, this is it. This will be the tipping point. This will be, where everything comes down. Of course, the police will investigate and find wrongdoing. Or, of course, the judiciary will investigate and find wrongdoing. So he's this curious moulding of someone who both seems somewhat cynical, but also still actually naive about the way in which these powerful institutions will be willing to collude to protect one another.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating. I've always been a freelancer, and I know Nick, and I know Carol Cadwalader. It's quite a similar story when she broke the Cambridge Analytica hacking, a different kind of hacking. And both of them at the Guardian Observer, did have that residual faith that there were liberal institutions which could challenge the gravitational pull towards inequality, abuse of power. I'm not sure they'd feel that way. I don't want no spoilers again anymore. And I remember particularly sitting with Nick during the phone hacking trial and what he said then, but let's wait till later episodes. And I think you're right. I think this was, it was like the Arab Spring, wasn't it? Somebody actually compared it, which was going on at the same time, to Steve Richards, I think. Oh, Murdoch's being toppled, a bit like these, tyrannies or these dictatorship in Arab countries. And the sense that things would change. And well, again, this was a window where there were still, I think, compared to now, I think especially the way you're talking about Starmer, but the way we talk about the media now, back then, I think people said, well, of course they'll investigate this. Of course the police will do something about this. We have these liberal institutions which don't surrender just to power and money.
Also then the perception that because they decided not to investigate, that was all fair and proper. The correct institutions had done their due diligence and thought, well, this isn't worth pursuing.
Good chaps theory of government, exactly. And I think that, and it's interesting to see you two, who are a bit younger, I might say, but you probably grew up knowing what happened with, it's like this, you know what I mean? But I think I too, their bliss was in it that dawn to be alive. 2011, Murdoch called between. Anyway, it felt like there was accountability.
Let's have a little deep dive then into maybe some of the more TV side of it. We kind of picked apart quite a lot of the real life stuff there and some of the kind of deep themes and stuff like that. How do we feel about? We've picked this apart a little bit, to be fair, already, but the kind of tone of the show surprised me. I was quite surprised with I think Femi, you've already mentioned the kind of Deadpool breaking the fourth wall style. I was quite surprised by that because when I watched the trailer, it was nothing like that. So I was like, oh, this is quite different. And there's the kind of the scenes that we said of him writing over it and over again. I'm not sure how much that worked for me personally, although now that you've explained it the way some of you have, I get why it's in there. But I found it frustrating as a viewer to watch him rewrite things over and over again. It felt a little bit too much, telling and not showing. But yeah, what do you think about some of the tone and the style of the show, the way the story was being told? Do we feel like, that the average viewer, he doesn't know a lot about the hacking scandal, is going to get a lot from it?
Personally, I liked it. I liked the fact that they had this Deadpool break the fourth wall style thing because it helped carry the audience along. Because the phone hacking scandal was a long time ago, involves a lot of moving pieces, and as you can see in the second episode, we'll see in the second episode, a lot of moving pieces to follow. So I think having somebody that can essentially hold your hand to say, all right, this is what this person was, this is who this person was, this person is now the prime minister, used to be DPP, that sort of stuff. I think that's useful with so many players that most people will never have heard of before. They'll just know the phone hacking scandal. They might know maybe Piers Morgan was somehow involved. That's pretty much what most people are at. So having that was useful. And I think a degree of humor, it also helps humanize the narrator, especially with the scene where he's opening the door to find out exactly who Mr. Apollo was, and you see various people make appearances. I quite like that.
I thought that, yes. Anyway, Mr. Apollo, I have my idea who that is. When you're, or plural, I thought that was a good way of dramatizing the problem of sources. Everybody now thinks of journalism as a deep dive in data. You get a leak, like the Boris files come or the Panama Papers. It doesn't work that way because, you need a hand to guide you as a journalist, and sources are really important. And the famous one, of course, is All the President's Men and Deep Throat you meet in the car park who guides you. And it's in that model. And so, look, on the style of it, I defer to you guys because it is so subjective. Having worked in journalism has to be objective, or else if you get the facts wrong, you end up in court and you lose your house, right? Let alone the ignominy of your peers. But what works aesthetically, what draws people in, what makes, and I think if I was their producers, I'd go David Tennant, one of the the most loved actors of your generation, really. I mean, he's older than you guys, but you would have seen him in Doctor Who. He would be, to use his character, his wit, his panache to get in the story. I completely understand why the scriptwriter did.
Yeah, I think those cutaways, and it's funny because Banseka and I were kind of messaging while we were watching, and Banseka, you mentioned The Big Short, the movie about the financial crash, and how that used these sorts of dramatic cutaways to explain the complexities of the financial system and how it worked. So actually, in the action of the show, the people who are in the thick of it are going about all this complex business, and then there's a moment where someone turns to camera and says, "Don't worry if you can't follow along. It is complex. Here's what this means." The ones that they did in The Hack were maybe not that strong in that way. Some of them were very sort of informative in saying, oh, this person was this and this person did that. But I feel like Gordon Taylor, for example, is introduced as this major character in the settlement. We don't really learn who Gordon Taylor is. He's just introduced as the head of the Premier League Footballers Association. What I really would have loved is a bit of that kind of cutaway. Get a cameo from some celebrity saying, this was the guy who dealt with footballers fucking up. If they were having affairs, if they were caught doing drugs,
Agreed.
If tabloids were trying to do some kind of big spin scandal on them, Gordon Taylor Taylor was the guy who tried to help it out, and that's why they hacked him. In the show, it's sort of, this is a name of a person who's quite a big public figure, so some of them worked really well, those cutaways and those sort of 4-4 breaking, David Tennant with his kind of raised eyebrow and quirky tone giving really useful bits of detail. But some of those bits of detail that weren't sort of, in the business of Nick Davies investigating, he wasn't stopping and going to himself, yes, Gordon Taylor, the guy who blah, blah, blah. But I think the audience needed to know some of that. And I think as the show goes on, or at least the hacking side of the show goes on, and more of these big players are introduced, like Max Clifford or Sienna Miller or Gordon Taylor and the various politicians who were mentioned, like Chris Bryant, of course, gets quite a big role in exposing more of the hacks. Just that kind of breakaway to the audience to go, at the time we knew who these people were, but now they seem like kind of distant past figures. So here's why they were important, and here's why their role in the hacking scandal needs to be just given that sort of 10-15 seconds of explaining. Maybe there'll be more of that.
And maybe a bit of archive, to be honest. You know what I mean? They couldn't use the masthead. There's nothing to stop them mocking out the front page.
Yeah.
It's a very good point. That actually is. It's like they've got this break the fourth. You call Deadpool? I don't watch these young movies. I don't know what Deadpool is. I imagine they talk to cameras. Use it like The Big Short. Whatever, you tell everything really clearly on that. Don't half do it.
Mm. Yeah, I that's definitely a fair point. I think knowing who Gordon Taylor was, I didn't know. Like I'm finding that out right now. But I think because they were holding our hands with the other stuff, I assumed, well, I guess I don't need to know. If they're telling us this stuff, but they're not telling us that stuff, I guess I just don't. I can probably still follow along the plot without knowing who he is. But yeah, it would have been useful to know.
Yeah, and I just thought some of the redacted moments, I was just like, I felt like it was just eating into time. I was like, I don't. I know they're trying to add a certain tone and flavour, and there's some of that is world building and bringing us into the world of journalism, which for most people is this kind of mysterious world. But I did get a bit impatient with that as well. I was like, you don't need to redact your son's name. Like, come on.
Yeah, I'm sure that, what do they call him, Beans or something? I'm sure there'll be a passing reference to my son Beans in a later episode, but I don't think we heard the word Beans mentioned the second time in this episode.
No.
What's important about those redactions is that it actually shows that Mr. Apollo, for example, we still don't know who that is. And it's a core part of how Nick Davies did the investigation, and we learned it at the select committee, which this episode ends with, is Nick Davies had this information, he had seen it and he knew, but he couldn't confirm it to others, because that's the nature of sources with journalism, is you have to take it on truth and trust that Nick Davies has met this person who gives him this information, but he can't reveal it. He has to reword it or rephrase it, or say the Guardian has seen documents which, and that's kind of a core element of this kind of investigative journalism. So then there need to be these sorts of, a normal member of the audience might be going, well, who is this person? How do they know this? How should I believe them? And you do have to take it on trust of Nick Davies being a very good investigative journalist and having to work between what he describes as the gaps between knowledge and what he can say in public.
Yeah. What's interesting is I quite like the idea of this being mirror image in terms of morality and capitalism, corporatism, and i.e. the interest of money versus the interest of morals. Because right now you've got Nick Davies being driven by the moral need to right this wrong, but also being constrained by the realities and the financial situation of working for the Guardian, having a freelance boss, and the economic damage that could come to them if they get sued for libel. And so you've got the desire for morality versus the constraints of corporatism. Whereas with the other way, if you look at it from the News of the World side, they are pursuing corporate agenda, and with the slightly maybe they've got a conscience telling them not to maybe do that. It's an interesting mirror image.
And just on that background, I mean, it's the Succession story. This is where Succession takes off, because basically 2008. Lachlan Murdoch, who's now in control, was out. He'd fallen out with Roger Ailes at Fox News, and it was James Murdoch coming in, clean sweep. He's also executive of Sky. He's the chief executive of Sky, be Sky B as it was then, and which is another Murdoch arm. He merged Thatcher. It's a long story. But Thatcher always allowed him to break regulation, create a broadcaster in Brussels, then come back. He didn't get the license, so he took over the company which got the license. There's a whole background to that, which hopefully we'll see. But there is an agenda, and that's the other way you can tell this story. I'm not saying they should do it, but what Succession does, like inside the power, inside the boardroom, they have in Succession, they have this thing with a scandal involving their cruise liners. How do we shut it down? How do we put that guy Tom on it? And,
it's fascinating, that episode of where they're trapped on a yacht. Succession is very good at that you're surrounded by so much luxury, but it all looks ugly because the people and the way they're behaving is so sort of disgusting and despicable.
It's like, I feel the same with what's that other one, White Lotus. It's
Yes.
like, oh my god, everybody's going to die.
Yeah.
But I think that is also the context, which, as I said, it may come up. This was a crucial moment for the Murdochs. This was the moment they were going to merge the TV and the newspaper empire. Maybe that'll come out later, and that's what there was a ticking clock. It's actually brilliantly written, the book. Actually, go and buy the book, everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Well, there's a new edition now with new chapters. And new
I know. I'm
revelations.
looking at trying to redact, put some of it on Byline Times. I can't work out how to edit it. But there is there's this ticking clock, which is they want this merger. And this is why they're going to push for camera and all that stuff to happen. And suddenly Nick Davis is coming across the bodies buried.
Yeah. And even in the book, he does report on what he later learned about what was going on within News International at the time of the Guardian revelations. And I think maybe it tells us something about the forces of power that were acting on the hack itself as a contemporary program, is that we know from secondhand accounts or internal accounts of how they were panicking, how they began the cover-up, how millions of emails were deleted, and how people were put out as sacrifices to save the more powerful people in the company. Do we see any of that in the show, or did the producers and ITV decide that this is too big of a beast to try and challenge? This will be stuff that has to happen peripherally, and we focus on Nick Davies,
or legally, right?
So,
yes. With Nick Davis' story, he's there. It's his book. It's his life rights. He can say I was there. Nobody can terminate his free expression. I don't want to give away these future episodes, but if you're going to show a chief executive, you're going to show what's going on, with the Murdochs, it's difficult to stand that up. Absolutely. You can get good sources.
If they're not going to give you the masthead, they're certainly not going to let you display Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson and Kuttner and James Murdoch and what they were up to.
What happens with Brooks and Coulson.
Well, yes. No spoilers.
It's so bad. Jesse Armstrong, wrote Succession. Always says, not the Murdochs.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
You have to say that.
You have to keep on saying that because they will sue you. Well, yeah, they will. They'll sue you.
Yeah.
So this show is this first episode is set in 2008, I think. Is that correct?
Into 2009, yeah.
2008/2009. Was there anything that you saw in the show where you were like, God, that's dated now? Like, what was the most 2008/2009 thing you think you saw in the show at anybody?
His car was old.
The car was older than 2009, surely.
Yeah.
His funny little, what is that, a Volvo? He had a Fox, didn't he?
That was like 80s car or something, I don't know.
But I can imagine
that's a real trope of hard scrabble investigator goes out to stoke people's flats in their old banger. Yeah.
I can't think of anything else which characterized 2008-9.
The length of the ad breaks?
Well, that's what the ad breaks.
The length of the ad breaks?
Yeah, that was very long, wasn't it? About 6 adverts. Me and Tom talked as well about we think we saw FIFA 2009.
We have to work out what edition of FIFA his son was playing, and I think he was playing with an Xbox controller, but there was a PS2 on the table, so a real gaff by the producers. Only a nerd gamer like me would spot it, but
they would generally get that right. So maybe, are you sure? So PS2 wasn't out by 2008?
No, the PS2 was out, but there's a big blocky square. This will have to be edited out. This is rubbish. But there was a big blocky square PS2 on the table, but he's got an Xbox controller. What I spotted, that thing that maybe not something that was out of time, but I noticed was that the staff at The Guardian who were portrayed, not just Ross Bridger and Davies, but all the sort of, I think they're kind of unnamed executives and assistant editors and so on, they look like a 2025 stereotype of a Guardian hipster, and not very much like the late 2000s crusties, which the Guardian were. It's all tweed jackets and sort of big thick rimmed glasses, not the kind of hipsters we know now. So I feel they missed out on a costume department opportunity to really go back into mid 2000s frumpy kind of outfits for the Guardian, and instead went with the more modern hipster interpretation of what we think the Guardian might look like inside its offices.
They had moved by then. Just interesting, in the Bourne Identity, the second one, it's set in the old Guardian offices, which were on Farringdon. I know the police lived there. And they did set the new one. They did. So the woman, that's Jill Phillips on the legal advice. That was, that's who saw. I didn't recognize anybody else, really.
Well, there is the reporter who quotes John Prescott in his very thick accent. And I think she's named in Nick Davis' book, but I can't remember her name. That must be a name. She has a name cast reference, I imagine.
Amelia Hill, I think. Anyway, sorry, inside information. What we care about is people who don't know the story, who don't know journalism, whether they're hooked. I suppose we won't know till next episode with how the ratings, if they fall off, because Mr. Bates, I mean, Mr. Bates caused, there was only 4 episodes of that with Toby Jones, caused a huge uproar, didn't it? I mean, I suppose I ask you, do you feel we're on the verge of another uproar, Mr. Jones and the Post Office kind of public debate?
I agree. I don't think we have enough yet. I think for people to get the same level of uproar, they would need to get a lot more bold in terms of, this person broke these laws and ruined these lives, you should hate them. This person who's currently still like widely producing. So unless I don't know, I don't think we're going to see anything from Piers Morgan in this, or some like major head to roll. Unless they really point the finger at somebody, I don't think it's going to have the same level of uproar as the Post Office scandal.
Yeah, and I have noticed as well, it does feel like my timeline of like journos and journalists has been quite quiet. I don't think many people in the industry are talking about it, really, to be honest, which also is indicative of the way we're still relying on, even in the social media age, I think we're still relying on bigger media driving these stories and making these stories matter, which is, of course, alluded to in this first episode, that the mechanics of how the media gears up to decide something is a story or not, well, you're relying on other media platforms deciding with you. And so, I guess I perhaps remain cynical that it's not within their interest to do so. So it probably won't happen, but we shall see.
Yeah, we're recording this the morning after the first broadcast of episode 1, and there have been a few reviews come out. The Guardian review, which I've read, is not a glowing review, we can say quite euphemistically, but towards the end, they sort of say, in the context of all the scandals we have going on now and the influence and power of information and media, the line is something like, the hack makes, as in the show The Hack, makes phone hacking seem quite quaint and distant. And I think that's a real worry for the show, is that this wasn't quaint and distant and, back then it may have seemed big, but now it seems quaint. No, even now it should be seen as this huge abuse of power. And I think if the show is coming across to audiences as like, oh, this was a sort of little mess up 10, 15 years ago, and it's not as big as the things we've got going on, I think that'd be quite a misfire by the show to have inadvertently presented phone hacking as something that's not quite as big as it's made out to be, as something quite quaint and, harmless from the past compared to what we've got today. As we were saying earlier, there hasn't yet been a real explanation of the harm of victims, like the individual people, not just celebrities and major public figures, but ordinary members of the public. And I know at this stage in the investigation, no one knew that there were ordinary people who had been really abused in tragic situations. But to have not pitched the opening episode of the show on the basis of, at the end, we will learn how abusive and harmful this was. If the Guardian's review is coming out saying that it's almost like a very soft punch, then there's a lot of work to be done to really explain to new audiences to this scandal how serious it still is. Not just how it was at the time, but how much that abuse and that harm still goes on today.
I think you warn one of you or Femi, I think maybe it's you, Tom, said, well, this how's the press going to react? Piers Morgan, I'm not sure we'll get that in this series, but I know his intimate of mirror connections with the Daniel Morgan suspects and the dark arts. So what their defense will be, either to ignore it, look over there, or go, oh, it's a long time ago, it wasn't that bad. There's a line by Marlowe, I think it's one of his Christopher Marlowe's plays, something he's accused of. Oh, that was a long time ago. Besides, the wench is dead. Let's put it. Moving on, and they'll say social media is much worse. They'll go, it's all changed.
They do that a lot.
Yeah, and right. If it falls into that, that's unfortunate. How do you make it live?
And that's a huge problem for me, because that the issue of not really bringing front and center the victims of this and who has actually suffered. I think that's a real problem, especially when you don't go into details of who Gordon Taylor actually was in that first episode. And it's the same issue that I had. Why even though the film Oppenheimer got massive acclaim, for me, I hated that film because it's all about Oppenheimer himself as a person breaking and nothing to do with any of the people in Japan. Like you see that at the end, but it's completely lost. And I think the same way, if you don't put the victims of this front and center, like real people, you're just focusing on the political class, as some would call it, rather than the actual people that suffered from this.
Yeah, I think that's a really... Oh.
No, stop. Do
you want to jump in one more time, Peter?
No, I'm sorry. I'm just going to say, imagine Mr. Bates to the post office without Mr. Bates. It's just called the post office.
Yeah,
the Horizon IT scandal. Yeah.
Yes.
We watch people typing numbers into a post office accounting system, and that's the scandal. Yeah.
Thank you very much, guys. I think that was a really interesting introduction to the first episode. Looking forward to seeing how some of these things unfold as we continue watching. And if you want to see a better media in the world, then you should also check out Better Media Bill, the Better Media Fund. And if you want a better media, then support the Impress Regulator as well. You can find out how at the link list bettermedia.world, which has links to loads of great ways to get involved with making a better media for all. Thank you very much for joining me, guys. See you next time.